Humans have a natural ability to grow accustomed to and comfortable with our environment, even if the circumstances we find ourselves in are initially unpleasant. If you move into an apartment that's close to a busy highway, you'll find that after a couple weeks the noise no longer disturbs your sleep, or at least disturbs your sleep less. Not because it has actually gotten quieter or because your ears have suffered such extreme damage, but because your brain simply does not acknowledge things as much after frequent or prolonged exposure. Now, if you instead grew up in that apartment next to the highway, you might never notice how loud it is until you try to sleep somewhere else and find that it is eerily quiet. There's a couple thoughts that might occur to you then. When I return home, will I be able to fall asleep now knowing it can be this quiet? And what else might be similar? Something I've lived with all my life, never noticing how unpleasant it is because I have yet to experience something different. Maybe it'll feel like a sudden jump to say that Uzumaki, the famed horror manga series by Junji Ito with the premise, "What if spirals were evil?" is about this experience. Like, what exactly am I gonna say is relatable here? What the fuck is this supposed to be? What is effective about this guy who just loves spirals so much he kills himself to become one, other than the horrific art and that it's kind of funny? The answer comes from thinking a little about how the spiral curse seems to operate in the story, which is why it's the title of the video. Typically, what we expect to see in a random chapter of Uzumaki is someone having their body altered and mutilated so that a spiral of some sort appears and slowly gets worse until they probably die. Or maybe they turn into snails and just live like that. The spiral, at its most obvious level, is a corruptive force that may harm anyone in the town. But something interesting to me is the way characters tend to react to these situations. If you think about the snails specifically, the affected characters don't panic and try to find a doctor. They kind of just roll with it until they are no longer human. And with the non-snail characters, they initially react with horror or disgust, but then the fact that one of their classmates turned into a snail just becomes normal, and he becomes their pet, and they move on with their lives. The power of the spiral is not just body horror. Possibly equally important is this kind of hypnotic trance characters enter, which allows them to accept what's happening to them and move on as if it's normal. Azami seeks no medical attention for the spiral scar slowly growing on her forehead and digging into her skull. The two young lovers discover their bodies twisting and realize, I guess this is a thing we can do now, and disappear into the ocean. The refugees sheltering in the row houses get contorted and entangled like this, and their primary concern remains preventing people from coming inside because they would take up too much space. In all cases, the spiral negatively affects the characters in some spiral-themed manner, and then they just carry on having adjusted to the effects, usually until they are killed by them. Except for, again, snails. Uzumaki seems to mirror this with how other residents tend to react to these events. Characters witnessing the spiral curse kind of just have to accept it as normal. Again, after the initial disgust or terror. I guess we have giant snails as pets now. I guess the lighthouse just does that now. I guess the whole town is just destroyed now. This is basically the same kind of hypnosis, just not happening to the people we see being mutilated by the spiral. And the people in the row houses later in the story specifically seem to indicate how these ideas are supposed to be tied together. At first, they are all unaffected by the spiral curse's physical effects. They are simply witnesses of it who begin to accept it as the way things are. But then, they eventually become victims of the physical contortions, and their attitude of acceptance carries over from their entrapment to the entanglement of their bodies. So, the spiral is something that prevents you from acknowledging the bad things happening to you or around you as abnormal. And maybe that already sounds familiar. Now I'd also like to talk about some of my favorite elements of the town which don't have such direct and horrifying effects on the characters. The Black Lighthouse is a detail of the town that gets some attention, and it kills some kids, sure, but otherwise, it's kind of just there, along with the weird sirens, the frequent whirlpools, the old row houses, and the spirals you can consistently see in the grass in the background. These features of the town aren't new horrors that the characters become hypnotized by. They're easier to describe as weird, or maybe slightly ominous or unpleasant. But they are details that Junji Ito draws our explicit attention to. The first chapter introduces the town and its oddities through a few pages shared by Kirie, a lifelong resident of Kurozucho, and Shuichi, who also grew up in the town but is coming back from school in the next town over. Shuichi expresses his distaste for the strange features of the town, calling attention to things that had been background details at most, and this makes Kirie's lack of strong reaction to them significant as well. To her, having lived here her whole life, these details don't deserve much attention. They are simply the way things are. Shuichi, meanwhile, has has seen a way of life different from that of Kurozucho, and this defining character trait of his has become an inability to not harp on the town's unpleasant oddities, and to constantly express his hatred towards it. It's really important that Junji Ito introduces this story with an eeriness coming from such relatively minor details. It introduces the concept of becoming used to something, losing awareness of it, before the introduction of the actual spiral curse, which does the same thing in a more supernatural and extreme way. Shuichi's descriptions of the town also lay out the more obvious fact that the spirals are literally this pattern or feature that you can't stop seeing once you become aware of them. This ties everything else in the story back to something as simple as being annoyed by the scenery of your hometown. Uzumaki's baseline is that there are unpleasant oddities around us of any significance, and the story sets itself up with the dichotomy between having noticed these oddities and only being able to perceive them as normal. From this point, I think it's clear how Uzumaki ends up being a strikingly effective representation of a common experience, meant to convey, in an exaggerated manner, a real discomfort many can relate to. What Junji Ito probably had in mind specifically was what it feels like to grow up in a small rural town and eventually want to leave. Growing tired or annoyed by the same scenery you see every day, beginning to notice the patterns of social conservatism and conformity that seem to restrict people's happiness, experiencing the relatable horror of having to deal with a recurring, annoying guy in the place you live. But it's easy to generalize. It conveys the same feeling as noticing the minor details you don't like anywhere you live, picking up on any kind of pattern that hurts yourself or others, and beginning to understand that these things are the result of powerful historical forces much larger and older than yourself or anyone you know. There's a first time you fully consciously recognize these things you dislike, and then the negative feelings grow as you begin to notice it more, and the more you notice it, the more you hate it. It causes a persisting cycle of your discomfort drawing more of your attention to something that you can only hate more the more your attention is drawn to it. It's another spiral. If we think of Uzumaki as a story about this kind of spiral, as well as the hypnotic trance of habituation, the individual chapters are no longer simply a collection of random, horrifying spiral-shaped events, but they become a narrative about Kirie basically waking up to the problems with her hometown as Shuichi already has. It is through hearing what Shuichi has to say that she can realize the horrors happening around her and to her are not just common sufferings of life, but horrific events that she's living through only because she's in this town. Through Shuichi, she explicitly knows that things aren't normal, that they don't have to be this way, and this is a kind of resistance to the trance effect that the spiral curse has. She breaks through the hypnosis of the familiar and enters the spiral of becoming increasingly aware of what is horrific about what could have otherwise been accepted as normal, and this is paralleled by the spiral curse gradually becoming more apparent and destructive as the story goes on, until it has completely consumed the entire town. All of these ideas are encapsulated pretty perfectly in chapter 4, the one where the dad makes the fucked up pottery with evil clay from the lake that all the cremation smoke flows into. It is only when Kirie first looks inside her father's kiln that she hears the voices coming from within, and from that point on, she is unable to stop hearing the screams. She breaks through the veil to become consciously aware of something, from which point she cannot return to being unaware of it. If you read Uzumaki looking for this concept, you'll realize how frequently it shows up. Kirie's growth is central to the narrative, but Shuichi and his parents get used to portray some different manifestations of the spiral of awareness. Shuichi's father becomes aware of and obsessed with the spiral pattern and its presence in the town, but he loves the spirals, and he ends up destroying himself. Shuichi's mother then identifies spirals as a danger, but becomes so obsessed with avoiding them that she also ends up killing herself. Her awareness of the spirals overwhelms her and turns into a self-destructive force. Shuichi, meanwhile, also recognizes the spirals as a negative force, just not to such an obsessive degree. Still, though, he isn't able to convert his awareness of the problem into as much positive change as he would like, as his own level of obsession and also his trauma kind of just make him come across as insane and eventually turn into a recluse. Kirie, for a while, remains unconvinced by his words and increasingly disturbed by his behavior, until her own run-ins with the spiral lead to her realizing Shuichi was right. Her full recognition of the spiral's hold on the town is represented by Shuichi cutting her hair in chapter 6. From this point forward, Kirie is the character most aware of the curse and the one with the clearest mind, feasibly able to direct the people around her away from its danger. The clearest route for the story to take, then, would be a good ending, where, after some struggle, the characters who are aware of the spiral curse manage to escape Kurozucho and live out their lives in a better place. It would be a strong prompt for the reader to do the same. It should turn your slight, possibly subconscious discomfort at negative aspects of your life into a nightmare at the forefront of your experience. You should consciously recognize stuff that you don't want to live with, and it should should conjure to your mind images of centipedes crawling in your ear, children being melted, or whatever the most horrifying image from this manga is to you. That discomfort should be a driving motivator to fight to get yourself out. There's a better place for you, and you can reach it. Do not succumb to the spiral. But that's not how the manga ends. Instead, Junji Ito chooses to take us down a path to deliver one final gut punch, to say it's not so simple. Many people find themselves trapped in their hometown, or whatever circumstances they're trying to escape. Even if they recognize what they don't like about it, even if they have the strength to work productively towards escape, the obstacles in front of them are simply too large to realistically overcome. Financial difficulty, family ties, or other connections keep them in a place that's killing them. The spiral is also a whirlpool, physically preventing you from leaving. And this is exactly what Kirie and Shuichi end up facing. Despite all their efforts, it turns out to be impossible to leave the town by the time they decide it's what they must do. The only way left to go is down. And so, Uzumaki concludes with the portrayal of the fear that even if you do wake up to the things wrong with your environment, you might still find yourself unable to escape it. The only thing you can do is embrace one of the few people who share your pain, surrender to it, and die. Uzumaki is kind of funny, because it's probably Junji Ito's best work, but at first glance, it might not really seem to do anything different from his other stories. In fact, the premise of this one might be one of the simpler ones. What if a bunch of random horrific events involving spirals happened? And like any Junji Ito manga, the premise and resulting situations are a mix of horrific and comedic, elevated by incredibly good artwork and a skill for building and paying off tension in the medium of manga. But the best pieces of horror, in my opinion, have to do more than execute premises like what if you saw a face, or what if there was a guy standing there, with extreme technical proficiency. They cut into more relatable fears, like that of the breakdown of familial relationships, or the trust you place in the people and systems around you turning out to be faulty. And like with any story, even if you don't consciously recognize it, when you've felt the emotion it's conveying, that's when technical proficiency is really able to multiply the story's effect on you. Even if you don't know it, you've felt the fear, and that's why a piece of great horror art sticks with you. I think people tend to rank Uzumaki as one of Junji Ito's best because it resonates with them in a more substantial way than just being disturbed by gore and body horror, even if they're not totally aware of it or able to put it into words. It portrays a common experience, noticing problems with the place you grew up as you get older and learn more about the world, realizing things you thought were normal aren't, that the life you're living is worse than it could be. You recognize how it's affecting the people you know without them being fully aware of the problem, and you question how many more silent cancers on your life must there be, killing you without you knowing, because you think it's just the way things are. The more you become aware of it, the more you feel the pain, and the more you feel the pain, the more aware of it you become. And then, despite you realizing how terrible this place is, despite how willing you are to get out, its pull might be too strong for you to escape, and just like everyone else, you succumb to being folded into the spiral. Hopefully the situations the rest of us are in aren't so hopeless. Our goal should still be to escape our Kurozuchos by finding a better place, or even fighting to create the better place where we currently stand. One with community, with beauty, that doesn't harm its inhabitants. For a lot of us, I think that better world is right outside our doors, in part created by us interacting with it. Anyways, this Halloween, I'm going out partying as Monkey D. Luffy. Y'all remember to go outside too.